In February 1858, a scouting detachment out of Fort Myers rode north along the Peace River into country the Army's own maps still left blank. The war against the Seminole had nearly run its third and final course, and what remained of it that winter was mostly waiting, watching the last holdouts decide whether to board a ship for the Western Territory or vanish deeper into the swamp. Lieutenant Ambrose Kirkland led 6 men and a guide the muster roll lists only as Tom, a name given to him by a quartermaster's clerk, and never corrected by anyone who might have known better. On the morning of February the 9th, the party came across a hole in the ground that the guide would not go near. It was not a small thing to notice in that country. Central Florida sits on limestone from the surface down, worked slowly hollow by rainwater for longer than any man in that column could reckon, and a scout who has ridden it long enough learns to expect to sink now and again, a place where the roof of some buried cavity gives way and the ground simply drops. Kirkland had already passed 2 or 3 that winter without remark. This one he stopped the column for, and that evening, by lamplight, he wrote it into his report in language plainer than anything else in his file that season. He called it "a hole no rain had cut alone." The detachment had been riding since first light through pine flatwoods and palmetto scrub, the kind of country that gives a column no clean line of sight past 30 yards in any direction, and the ground had been rising and falling under them all morning, the way karst country does. In shallow swales a man on horseback barely notices. Tom had been out front on foot for most of the ride, as he usually was, moving through the brush at a pace the mounted men had learned to match without being told. He stopped without a signal a good 60 yards short of the rim, well before the trees thinned enough for anyone else to see what had made him stop, and Kirkland's report records that the rest of the column closed the distance expecting a Seminole camp, or a body, or nothing at all. What they found instead was the hole. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Kirkland's men found was a near circular opening in the rock, perhaps 60 feet across at the rim, dropping in broken shelves to a pool of water so clear that a private named Ruel Doss wrote home that he could see clean to the bottom of it from the edge, which by Kirkland's own estimate placed the visible floor something on the order of 40 feet down. Florida sinkholes of that kind are common enough along the spring belt that runs down the peninsula, fed by the same aquifer that surfaces at warm mineral springs and a dozen places like it, and a soldier who had passed through the territory before would have known one on sight and ridden on. What stopped this detachment was what stood at the bottom of the water, visible through it the way a stone is visible through a still creek. Not a boulder, not the collapsed rubble a sink usually holds. A squared edge, pale against the darker rock around it, running level for a stretch, Doss guessed at 8 or 10 feet before the water and the angle took it from view. 2 of the men waded in to the point where the shelf dropped away and could go no farther without a line. What they reported, and what Kirkland copied into his report without comment of his own, was that the edge held a true right angle where it met a second edge running back into the rock, and that the surface between them was smooth in a way the limestone above it was not. Limestone weathers unevenly. It pits, it channels, it takes the shape of whatever acid and time have done to it that century, and it does not resolve itself into a corner. The Seminole and the Calusa peoples, who had lived on that peninsula for centuries before any of this, built earthworks and shell mounds in enormous, patient quantities, but dressed stone masonry was never part of that record, not on that coast, not in that era, and every man in the column who had cause to know it said so. Doss's letter goes further than Kirkland's report allows itself to. He wrote that the water held a temperature the men could feel through their boots the moment they stepped into it, colder than the shallow pools they had crossed all week, and that the stone underfoot on the shelf was slick in a way none of them expected from rock that had presumably sat exposed to slow mineral buildup for years. He wrote that the color of the exposed edge was darker than the pale gray limestone forming the rim above it, closer to the color of a hearthstone than a quarry face, and that when one of the men struck it with the flat of a hatchet to test whether it was rock at all, the tool rang rather than thudded, a sound Doss compared in his letter to striking a church bell some distance off. Kirkland's own report does not mention the sound. It mentions only that the surface, when struck, showed no mark and no chip, which is the kind of detail an officer includes because he cannot account for it and does not know what else to do with it. Tom would not go closer than the tree line. Kirkland's report notes this once, in a single sentence, and then does not return to it, which is itself worth sitting with, since Kirkland was not a man who left threads hanging in his other reports that season. The interpreter attached to the detachment, a civilian named Aldous Ferris hired out of Tampa for the campaign, tried to get a fuller account and wrote in his own separate notes, which survive in a private collection in Bradenton, that Tom said something short in Miccosukee when he saw the water and would not repeat it when asked, and that Ferris did not press him a second time. Ferris's notes end the entry there. There is no third attempt recorded, by him or by Kirkland, to learn what was said. The record simply closes around it, the way it closes around a great many things that winter, and the silence is the only part of the exchange anyone thought to preserve. The Fort Myers post-return for that week is otherwise a complete document, filed daily in a command that took its paperwork seriously under a colonel who wanted no gaps handed to Washington. The entries for February the 9th and 10th are missing. The 8th ends with the detachment's departure noted in the usual hand. The 11th resumes with the detachment's return, also in the usual hand, and gives a total of miles covered for the week that does not reconcile with the miles logged on the 8th alone. 2 days sit between those entries with nothing written against them at all, not even the customary line noting no incident to report, which appears on every other blank day that season. A blank day was still a day someone wrote down. These two were not. Kirkland's full report, the one that describes the hole and the squared stone beneath the water, was not filed with the post-return. It was written separately, addressed to the district commander directly, and a copy of it exists today only because Kirkland's grandson donated a box of family papers to a historical society in Fort Myers in 1951, unaware that the fort's own surviving correspondence from that campaign had nothing matching it. The Army's copy, if one was ever filed, is not in the collection at the National Archives that otherwise holds the district's paperwork from that war in something close to full. What survives is Kirkland's own hand, kept by his family for 93 years before anyone outside it read it again. There is a receipt among the same family papers, easy to miss beside the report itself, made out to the quartermaster's stores at Fort Myers for 200 feet of new hemp line issued to Kirkland's detachment on February the 11th, the day the post-return resumes. No requisition survives explaining why a scouting party needed that much rope, and no later entry records the line being returned to stores or written off as lost. A detachment mapping open country for a war nearly finished does not, as a rule, requisition rope by the 100 feet. Whatever it was used for, the record that would explain it sits inside the same 2 missing days that swallowed everything else. 3 men went back 3 days later, on Kirkland's order, with a line and a weighted lead, to sound the pool and measure what they could reach. The lead found the shelf at roughly 12 feet, as expected, and then dropped past it. Past the shelf, the line ran out to a depth Kirkland recorded as beyond what 40 feet of rope allowed them to test, which meant the pool did not bottom out anywhere near the stonework they could see. The squared edge sat on a ledge above a drop the detachment had no equipment to sound. Doss's letter home says the men tied off the line at its full length and hauled it back up without an answer, and that nobody suggested trying again with more rope. The column moved on that afternoon. Kirkland's report does not say the site was ordered closed. It simply stops describing it and moves to the next day's march, and no later Army document from that district mentions the sink by name again. That is not the only account of stonework surfacing where 19th century Florida industry cut into the rock. In 1894, a phosphate prospecting crew working a pit along the upper Peace River, roughly 40 miles north of where Kirkland's detachment had stood, opened a sink during blasting that exposed what the foreman's own notebook, held today by a family in Bartow, describes as a fitted stone floor beneath 11 feet of phosphate matrix and river gravel. The crew worked the pit for 4 more days, took samples for assay, and then abandoned that section of the claim entirely, filling the exposed floor back in with tailings within the week, a decision the foreman's notebook attributes only to the site running thin, though the assay figures recorded 2 pages earlier show ore grade holding steady right up to the point work stopped. The foreman's notebook gives one more detail worth holding on to. 2 of his men, before the pit was abandoned, tried prying loose a corner of the exposed floor with a pick to see how deep it ran, and the notebook records that the pick turned in one man's hands without the stone giving up so much as a splinter. An entry followed 2 lines later, by that same man's name crossed off the crew roster for the following week, with no cause given. In 1911, a turpentine and timber crew cutting along the edge of the Okefenokee Basin in South Georgia, working ground that shares the same limestone shelf as the Florida Peninsula beneath it, struck a similar formation while digging a drainage ditch, a level stone surface with a squared edge running beneath standing water at a depth the crew's own timekeeper measured with a plumb line at just under 9 feet before the line went slack into open water below it. The timekeeper's daybook, which survives in a county archive in Waycross, records the depth, the dimensions of the exposed edge, and then a single line noting the ditch was rerouted around the spot the following morning, without explanation for the change in a project that had otherwise run on a fixed survey line for its entire length. The daybook's final mention of the site, added almost as an afterthought 2 pages later, notes that none of the ditch crew would take the night watch on that stretch of the line for the remainder of the job, and that the foreman stopped assigning it rather than press the matter. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What connects these 3 sites is not proximity. They sit across 2 states and a stretch of more than 50 years, worked by soldiers, miners, and timber cutters, who never read one another's paperwork and had no reason to invent a matching story. What connects them is the shape of the response. In every case, men who had every commercial or military reason to keep digging stopped instead, quietly, without an order anyone wrote down, and moved the work somewhere else. A phosphate crew does not walk away from ore that is still assaying well. A timber operation does not reroute a fixed drainage line for no recorded cause. An army detachment that had come that far into hostile country to map it does not turn a discovery worth a full separate report into a single paragraph and then never raise it again. Whatever each of these crews found beneath the water, the instinct it produced was the same one, 3 separate times, in 3 separate decades, among men who shared nothing else. The stone itself, where anyone managed to bring a piece of it up, tells a narrower story than the surrounding limestone would suggest. A rancher named Silas Tillis, working cattle on land not far from Kirkland's Sink 2 generations later, pulled a fragment of squared, dressed rock out of a drainage channel on his property in 1923, a piece roughly the size of 2 hands together, with one face worked flat and a corner still holding a true right angle after however long it had sat in moving water. Tillis kept it on his porch for the rest of his life, using it as a doorstop, and his family still has it, kept now in a house outside Arcadia, Florida, never donated, never tested by anyone with instruments better than a rancher's own eye. It is, as far as anyone has established, the only piece of this stonework that a living family can put a hand on today. A field geologist with the Florida Geological Survey named Warren Attaway investigated Tillis's find in 1926, drove out from Tallahassee, photographed the stone, and wrote a short preliminary memo describing it as an anomalous inclusion warranting further field survey of the original sink location. The memo names the sink by the same general description Kirkland's report gives, cross-referenced against an old county land survey, which means Attaway had found and read Kirkland's account, or something very like it, 68 years after it was written, and decades before the family papers containing it were ever donated to a historical society. Where he found it is not recorded anywhere in his surviving correspondence. The follow-up survey Attaway proposed is not in the agency's records. Attaway's subsequent published work for the survey, all of it traceable through the state's own bulletin series, moves entirely into groundwater hydrology and never again touches archaeology or anomalous formations of any kind, a shift in subject that his own colleagues later described, in an oral history interview recorded decades afterward, as sudden and never explained by Attaway himself. One of those colleagues recalled him saying only that some ground was better mapped than dug. He worked for the survey another 22 years and retired from it without publishing a second word on the Peace River stone, and without, as far as any surviving record shows, ever visiting the site itself. What the geometry itself demands, if the measurements taken by 3 separate parties across 3 separate decades are taken at face value, is a squared, dressed surface sitting on cast limestone bedrock that took its current shape through dissolution over a span of time longer than any human presence on that peninsula the accepted record allows for. Limestone cast forms slowly, through millennia of acidic rainwater working through stone, and a sink opens where a cavity beneath that limestone finally loses its roof. For dressed stone to sit inside that cavity, resting on a ledge below the point where 3 independent parties struck it, the stone did not fall into a hole that later formed around it. The stone was there before the hole was, set into rock that had not yet dissolved into the shape it holds today, which places its working further back than any account of who could have dressed stone on that coast is prepared to allow. None of the 3 parties who found it were looking for anything of the kind. A scouting detachment mapping a war's last weeks, a phosphate crew chasing an assay grade, a drainage gang cutting a straight line through a swamp. None of them arrived looking to prove anything, and none of them stayed long enough to build a case either way. What they left behind instead was a set of measurements that agree with each other across 53 years and 2 states, a rope requisition nobody can explain, an assay that held steady the week the work stopped anyway, and a single crossed-out line in an officer's own hand, describing the one man in the column who would not look at the water twice. Kirkland's report closes on a line his family kept along with the rest of the document, one he did not include in the fair copy he filed, and that survives only in his working draft, crossed through, but still legible beneath the ink. It reads that Tom had looked at the water, said his short word, and would not look at it again the whole time the detachment stayed. Kirkland struck the line, the draft shows, and left it out of what he sent forward, which means the only surviving account of what a man who would not go near that water actually did is the one line its author decided the army did not need to read. The sink itself is still there, 40 miles of overgrown ranchland from the nearest paved road, on private property whose current owners have declined, more than once, to allow a survey crew onto the site. Nobody has sounded that pool with anything better than a 19th century lead line since Doss and 2 other privates tied off their rope and rowed away without an answer in 1858. Whatever sits below the shelf they could reach is still down there, past the depth they could measure, in water that has not changed since the day they left it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.